everyone. Welcome to our first panel discussion for today. I have a few announcements to get us started, and then we'd like to get into the meat of our topic to give us all enough time to ask questions and engage the line of speakers that we have today. So just as a reminder, childcare is available in Cyprus. It's available during all the lectures. You can see the reception desk if you want to know what the schedule is. Please don't drop off your kids if they're not feeling too well or if they're sick. I keep hearing the stories of the year where everyone went home with a flu. So please just be careful about that. Youth between ages 7 and 15 should be attending the youth program located in Grand Ballroom AD. And of course, as usual, please do turn off your cell phones. Check that during the program. So I'm very excited today. We have an excellent lineup of speakers. I think we're waiting for Haj Hassanein. And the topic is the spiritual crisis of the modern man. Now the format, as you can kind of tell from the setup, is a little different. There's no prepared talks on behalf of our speakers today, but it's rather more of a discussion format. So I'll be setting the stage with some introductory remarks and raising specific issues that I'd invite our speakers to address once we open the floor up to discussion. So I'll go ahead and start with that. And then in the very end, just keep in mind we'll be opening it up to the audience. So please keep your questions to yourself for now, and then in the end, I think there's mics in the aisles, and you're welcome to line up for that to start with your questions. Assalamu alaikum. So Muslim reformists have been characterized as challenging and often disregarding the classical Islamic tradition due to its alleged stagnancy and decline. Markers of decline were often set by external measures, so particularly Western concepts and values. As such, the critiques of the reformists were often viewed as a means of uncritically importing European concepts and values. In this context, we know now that the reformists were often informed by a narrative of decline that was produced and assumed in the colonial period. The narrative asserts that the Islamic world suffered an intellectual crisis from which it never recovered. That is, after the 12th century, and particularly after the attack of Ghazali on philosophy, the idea is that the Islamic world produced nothing of significance in the fields of science and technology, philosophy, theology, and in general, all rational inquiries. The decline narrative was also informed quite transparently by a broader definition of modernity that presumed a necessary break with tradition and religion. The modern became the symbol of progress and intellectual emancipation, while tradition and religion, on the other hand, was the symbol of stagnancy. Thus, the truly modern subject is a subject who is free of tradition, or at least puts tradition in its proper place. Religion, for example, has its proper place in the private sphere and not the public sphere. This distinction has informed Western political projects since the colonial period. Reformism in challenging the Islamic classical tradition was often viewed internally by many Muslims as a radical rejection and as a superficial engagement with the religious tradition. As such, the natural consequence and response was fundamentalism, and I put that in quotes because I think the term is problematic, but in the least we all kind of know what we're referring to when we speak of fundamentalists. It's a means to reject artificial imports by going back to a pristine past and pristine texts of the Quran and Hadith. But this was also, in its own way, a rejection of tradition. Ironically, in this sense, the fundamentalists are just as modern as the liberal reformists that they were responding to. So what I hope for us to do today is complicate these categories and these narratives that I think are problematic, since they don't seem to capture subjectivities that may emerge in a modern Muslim world. while there's undoubtedly much to be critical of, is there within the classical Islamic tradition resources from which to draw on in responding to the challenges of modernity? Is the Islamic tradition committed to fixed tenets, or does it evolve within its own internal structure of coherence? How or who determines what is fixed and what evolves? And how might we find a framework to tackle new challenges? We're all, of course, already products of modernity in our own ways, and so a big part of answering the question of where we ought to go lies in kind of detangling the ways in which modern concepts have informed our frameworks and our concepts. So in a sense, I hope that we get a chance to kind of interrogate our religious and our intellectual genealogies. Now, we're lucky to have with us today 4 very esteemed scholars to address some of these issues. Starting on my far left, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, Sayyid Sulaiman Hassan Ali, Professor Tariq Ramadan, and Haj Hassanain Rajab Ali. And I'd like you to please refer to your booklets for fuller bios. So basically, the structure is I'll be starting with a few general questions, and I'd invite them to talk to each other. Please disagree with each other to make it a little more exciting. And then in the end, we'll again be opening it up. So I'd also like to ask the speakers very gently to please limit your remarks to 3 to 4 minutes in addressing each of the questions. I think Sister Zainab has some time cards for us to pay attention to. And so please just limit it to that. I have far too much respect for each of you to cut you off, so please don't make me do that. So the first question I'd like to start off with, and these are pretty general questions, and you're welcome to address some of the specific issues I've raised. First is, let's kind of define our terms. So when we talk about modernity, what exactly are we talking about? And what, in your opinion, are some of its most urgent challenges for us as Muslims? So there's a lot of different senses of modernity, modern science and technology, modern modes of thought, modern understandings of the meaning of life. So what challenges do these ideas of modernity pose to us as Muslims? And I'd invite you all to choose amongst yourselves who would like to start. Sayyid Sulaiman, please.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Abil Qasim al-Mustafa. وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين. Respected scholars, dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is an honor to be in this esteemed company. This conference is one that I personally, and I'm sure many of you who have been here before, look forward to year after year. And I think the topic of this panel discussion and many of the other topics that we will have in the coming sessions are very interesting and hopefully will be of lasting benefit to all of us. With respect to the initial question, I believe that several of our academic colleagues and participants will have more insights, but I would like to begin from a religious perspective or from an Islamic perspective that I think is essential for us to keep in mind. And it's very difficult to do so, sometimes on a theoretical level and sometimes on a practical level. And that is that as a Muslim, we never act just as a human being. In other words, we don't compartmentalize our religion, we don't compartmentalize our values and say that there is a human issue, for example, that I will deal with as a human being and not as a Muslim. that is one of the spiritual and the religious challenges that I think for many Muslims it's difficult to find workarounds. It's difficult to interact with others in society, especially when you're confronted with a great deal of diversity, and feel that you can be fully a Muslim and at the same time be respectful, in some cases tolerant, in some cases accepting, and a full participant within society. That challenge, I think, has certainly come from many of the social structures and political structures that have changed from traditional societies into our modern social and political structures that all of us are subject to. And I hope that as we explore, we'll be able to have the insights of our panel and the audience and participants in how to frame and how to bridge that gap that I'm sure many of us can say that we do feel and we can relate to. You said to be brief, so I will pause there.
Okay, well, if by modern we mean that we all have a sense of our subjectivity as individuals who are broadly speaking autonomous in the way in which we make decisions, whether or not that's true. And if by modern we mean notions of the world around us which are primarily defined by scientific observation, which are defined by desacralized notion in which certainly nature is not sacred, nor is there any notion of the noumenal within the phenomenal. And I guess if by modern we mean this notion of a society which is about me and about constantly being obsessed with myself and with what it means for me to live and be authentic, then unfortunately that's probably true of most of us, if not all of us. Whether we're religious or not. So in some ways we're inexorably modern because these are elements of our society and our training and our education which you cannot suddenly reject. For example, I'll give an example. The school I went to always is proud of describing itself as a 17th century school because it says the 17th century is about the rise of the self, the rise of the individual. It's about John Locke, it's about John Dryden. It's about these great figures who in some ways may have been religious, but to a certain extent their religious practice was set aside to the way in which they saw their role in the world. So at that level, we're all inexorably kind of modern. But also, we've got to also remember that perhaps there's a famous French philosopher who I'm sure Tariq can talk about more, Bruno Latour, who's of course has a very interesting little book which says, actually we've never been modern. Individuals in our society have never really been modern quite simply because they've never actually attained to that rank of how we understand subjectivity. We've never been entirely autonomous with what we live. We've never entirely overcome tradition. And that's the fun. If you talk about modernity as a particular historical phase which comes out after tradition, we've never really overcome tradition. We're still bound in traditions even though we might have rethought them in certain ways. And the fact that traditions perpetuate and continue has a lot to do with how people engage within them. So on the one hand, we're all inexorably modern. On the other hand, we never have been modern. So how do we go forward? It comes back to, this is a classic academic fudge, basically. It entirely depends on where your particular tastes are, where you want to take it to. The one thing which I would just mention as the last thing is, for me, perhaps we will talk about Heidegger, but for me, one of the key issues is not this issue of subjectivity. It's basically how does technology affect us as people who live within this world? And how does technology fundamentally depersonalize and dehumanize our relationships?
How would you define modernity?
Well, with
What's
those
the
kind of,
definition?
precisely with those sorts of concepts I was talking about, the notion of science as the master narrative, which is about observation, about experimentation, about falsifiability, if you want.
So modernity is synonymous to science?
No, that's one aspect of it, and the other aspect of it, which is related directly to it, is this notion of subjectivity.
Right.
Sort of a Promethean man or human who has complete control, autonomous control over the decisions that that person makes and over their destiny, which is actually deeply embedded in a lot of modern Muslim thinkers. A classic example is someone like Iqbal. Iqbal's concept of the person and selfhood is a deeply kind of modern concept of personhood. It's not a traditional kind of Sufi concept of personhood.
So the definition, forgive me for just jumping because I just trying to understand it, is it would be relative to traditions. In other words, you would need traditions as the guiding light, and anything that's the antithesis to it would be modern.
Traditionally, yes, so to speak. I mean, as I said, modernity is always the flip side of tradition. Yeah. In that sense, it's true. But as I said, if you turn it around and say, well, have we ever been modern? Have we ever even overcome the tradition? That's one way of doing it. And on the other hand, you can actually say, well, we can't actually be traditional because even our concept of tradition is going to be mediated by modernity. So what happens is you have a phenomenon of what I would call neo-traditionalism, which is basically redefining tradition after the fact of, modernity has created a certain type of rupture. So you suddenly invent a tradition, you invent a golden age, you invent like a time when things were great, which you want to kind of recover.
No, I think you want to say something. I just want to, I'm trying to understand it from a layman's perspective rather than from a very deeply academic position. Sometimes when we use terminologies, it tends to be confusing to the average. I just think that these terminologies like modernity, traditions, they're not exclusionary. It's almost like people who say creation versus evolution. There is this implied notion that they're exclusionary, when in fact they're one and the same. People ask me about evolution. I said evolution is a created system. And that solves the problem. Evolution is a created system. And that just knocks it right out. Because there's this implied notion that there's exclusionary notions. So modernity versus traditionalism has this exclusionary concept. Because, traditions, when they were established, were modern at that time. So when was it never modern, is I think what you're trying to say. But the way I look at it, just from my 2 cents worth, I feel that when we define terminologies and we understand them, it gives us a better gauge on how to move forward. But I think the bottom line is the question is with regards to morality, the moral question. If you look at the Quran, and many times I'm asked that question when I speak in non-Muslim audiences, like, your book is 14 centuries old. Why don't you readapt it to the modern times? Why don't we have a new version of the Quran? And my simplest answer I give them is that morality, the Quran is a prescription of morals, the do's and don'ts of good and bad. And morals are not bound in time. So the idea of adapting it over time is absurd. Meaning morals don't change in time. And since the Quran is a book of morals, the idea of adapting it to modern times is absurd. Because you can't change the good qualities and bad qualities. Those are timeless. And I think that's really the way I reflect on it. And I think often when we discuss these, like when you're saying that the modern man, has lost spirituality. I mean, we're all spiritual. When we talk about selfishness, I think it's inescapable. We have to be selfish. Even Quran says, "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu alaykum anfusakum." Take care of yourselves. O you who believe, take care of yourselves. قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارٍ. Save yourselves and your family. So where do you draw the line to be selfish and non-selfish? You know, when is a person ever not selfish? Even on Judgment Day, Allah says nothing will help you. You know, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. You know, take care of yourself. So where do we draw the line to the term selfishness, to being very altruistic, or to be very self-serving? I mean, selfless, in other words. And I think that would be a good discussion for us in trying to understand that when the modern thinking came into perspective, and here I'm using the term modern, meaning something that's charging against an established system like Islam, in saying that these traditions that you follow all need to be reinvented. This notion, of course, is a direct threat to any system. And I feel that Islam is extremely adaptive, but I think it has maintained its moral principles in a more firm way, and I think that's where the challenges come. You know, why don't we reinterpret the Quran to allow, for example, homosexuality to be legal? You know, that would be modernity, or some people call it liberalism. But inshallah, I just figured.
I think we have a bunch of very intriguing questions. I think we should hear from Professor Ramadan as well, and then maybe we can try to latch on to a few of those threads.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, I want to thank you for this invitation, and it's a pleasure for me to be with you today. And especially this is the first time I'm attending this conference here, and I think I'm very happy to be here. It's not an easy question, and I think that the way you put it first is right. And this is why I agree or disagree with you on the fact that we have something which is very important when it comes to the way we deal with other civilizations or concepts and terminology. When we come back to the Quran and we say, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. The fact that there is this diversity, التعارف here, this mutual knowledge, is also to listen to what the people are saying about their own concepts. And it's something that we need to understand what they mean when they are talking about modernity. It's not for us to say, for example, I would say, no, that's not true. Modernity has nothing to do with homosexuality, and to be modern doesn't mean that we have to accept that. That's not the way the West would talk about it. So, the first is intellectual probity and intellectual honesty is, what do you mean by this? And then we take a stand. I would say that, for example, if we listen to what is said by, for example, the French philosopher and sociologue Turenne or Rawls, for example, when they talk about modernity, they say 5 principles. First one is the primacy of the individual. That's essential, and this is where it's about the self, but it doesn't mean selfishness. It's not exactly the same. The self it's the self first. Do we agree with this? Yes or no? This is one. The second is rationality. Do we have a problem with rationality as a Muslim? We don't. The problem is rationality the final answer to everything? No. This is not what we are saying. But we acknowledge the fact that rationality is something which is essential. Third, progress. Do we have a problem with progress? We don't. But there is something here which is the way we define modernity is the primacy of the individual, rationality, progress, and then comes something which is important, is freedom. And then the fifth one that they put, for example, Turenne is talking about this, it's talking about secularity or secularism. Meaning, in fact, you are not going to get any of the the first four, if you don't have the last one. Why? Because the Western experience is the primacy of the individual, rationality, freedom, and progress came through the secularization process. And I think that we need to understand this because this is where we have to answer to something which is, in fact, I would say, and this is where I agree with you, anyone who is telling me or trying to make me understand that modernity is after tradition, I say, I'm sorry, modernity is a tradition. It's coming from somewhere. It's in itself a tradition. Then we have to understand the system, the paradigm, the narrative that is behind it. And this is where, as Muslims, I wouldn't just reject the concept. I want to understand the system to say, my answer to this is I don't have a problem with this if and only if I start with the two fundamental principles of Islam, which is understanding al-fitra, fitrat Allah, التي فطر الناس عليها, وال-khilafah, meaning إني جاعل في الأرض خليفة. I'm going to put on earth someone who is understanding one thing which is very important. You don't have the final ownership of everything on earth. You are just here to manage. Al-Khilafah means that, yes, we are going to be rational, but rational understanding the goals. And the goals is Al-Ubudiyyah. And this is where we understand that we come with all these concepts, but we have a system, we have a paradigm, we have principles through which we come to these. So I don't have a problem with rationality, but rationality without faith, or without understanding our own limits, is arrogance. And arrogance is shaitani. Rationality with Allah is humility. Rationality with Khilafah is humility. So this is where I think that we have to take this discussion, but I wouldn't just come to define the concept if we don't understand the concept within the whole understanding, which is the cosmology. This is the understanding of the way we deal with Allah. What does it mean to say and to understand what is to worship Allah? So terminology is important, but terminology with a concept of life and death, which is also something that we have to add and to put within this discussion. Wallahu a'lam.
Thank you, Professor Ramadan and Hajj Hassanein and Professor Rizvin Said Sulaiman. I think at this point I'd like to move on to the second question that might be a happy medium between the concerns that I see on either side over here. So the influential philosopher Charles Taylor, who's spoken quite a bit on modernity, he says that one of the most pressing concerns that we have, that's most personal and most immediate to each of us, I think, that modernity has posed is the crisis of faith. So after a modern, given modernity and given the skepticism that I think it's posed in each of us, I think at some point in our lives we've had quite a bit of questions and quite a bit of doubt about certain aspects or entirely. So given that crisis, is faith possible still? And if so, on what basis? So I think I'd like maybe to start with Professor Ramadan, since we ended with you, and then go back around again. And maybe this also touches on the issues of rationality that you're raising. So what do we mean by reason as a criteria, and what kind of criteria can we use in terms of faith? And I think this is probably more along the lines of practical concerns that Hajj Hassanein was raising. So please, Professor Ramadan.
I think that when it comes to define modernity as a crisis of faith, this is where, once again, as Muslims, I would say that we cannot deny the fact that for many Muslims living in the West now, they are challenged by questions that are, this is the very notion of doubting. In Islam, there is something which is essential. Al-Iman, in fact, is not exactly the way we translate faith or belief. In Iman, there is Aman. There is a space where you are in security, where your questions get the answer. So you are at peace when you get the right answer. And for us, in fact, إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, and this is why I spoke about the fitrah, is for us, what is important is you will find the answer to your question when you come back to your heart. It's a rational journey coming to your heart. So, you know, Pascal, Blaise Pascal was saying, your reason has, your heart has reasons that your reason doesn't know. And my answer to this is, in Islam, your heart has its reason, your reason will recognize, acknowledge. If you go to this, to and this is where, from the very beginning in Islam, we don't have a problem with reason, because there is an understanding where reason lies in the whole understanding of our relationship to the universe, our relationship to Allah. And nothing in the Quran, nothing in the religion is in contradiction with reason, if we start right. And this is where I think that we need to be able, as Muslims, not to be scared. And this is why sometimes I see among Muslims an attitude that is not an Islamic attitude. It's not coming from our tradition. It's coming very often by this alienation that we had through avoiding critical questions, as it happened in the Christian tradition. We don't have this problem. We don't have to be scared of that. We are not scared of knowledge. That's the opposite. Deep knowledge means deep faith. Deep faith requires deep knowledge and scientific knowledge, all the knowledges. And this is why إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. The ulama here are not only the scholars of the text, they are all the ulama. All the ulama mean all the people of knowledge. And this is why our question here is always to reconnect the way we use rationality with the goals. And this is, once again, in ethical terms, when it comes to our religion, to understand that the way you use sciences, the way we use our aql is always by respecting goals, ahdaf. And the ends for us is the way we are going to serve Allah. So this celebration of rationality from an Islamic perspective should be put into something which is the deep crisis of modernity. It's not in fact a crisis of faith only. It's a crisis of goals. What are the ends? Why do you have this knowledge? What do you want to achieve? And this is where the Islamic perspective is always to come back to a very simple dua. A very simple one, but it changed everything. Allahumma nas'aluka ilman nafi'a. God, we ask you useful knowledge. What is useful for a human being? How do we talk about useful? How do we talk about useful? Useful for what exactly? To achieve power? Or to achieve serving God? To achieve respecting nature? Or using nature for the worse? These are the essential questions. So I think that we should put this rationality into something which is a universe of meaning and or questioning the goals, and not only being completely obsessed with the means. Rationality is not only a means, it's also questioning the goals. And I think as Muslims with our faith, this is a question that we have to start with. Wallahu a'lam.
Add to that?
Well, I would just say that in some ways it's surprising that you picked that out from Charles Taylor, because one of the interesting things about him is precisely to bring kind of religion out back into the public sphere.
Right.
And one of the problems of saying that the contemporary world is all about a crisis of faith has in the background of this notion that we define faith or our religious commitment as a set of beliefs in certain truth propositions, right? So that, we believe because we hold X to be true, Y to be true, and so forth. And this is something which is entirely an element of our internal states. And that's, of course, not the way most religions work. It completely negates this idea that you have that individuals live within societies and communities, and actually the communal practice of religion is an extremely important part of what people think they're doing, and also an increasingly a very important part of why people are religious as well. And if anything, one of the contributions I think of someone like Taylor's work is to precisely say, well, hold on, this kind of liberal autonomous notion we have of the self, it comes out of particular history, but it's not an accurate reflection of any sort of reality that any of us live. And so we need to think about why it is that we do things. So reducing faith to kind of belief in certain sets of propositions doesn't really make sense. And of course, that's probably not why people believe. Even if you go back to classical arguments, so you have lots of these classical arguments for the existence of God. Now the question obviously is, did any of these arguments actually convince anyone who didn't believe? You know, did someone like encounter Ibn Sina's argument and suddenly say, there must be a God. Clearly, he's right. It's sound. It's logical. You know, the form works. I don't think it works like that. I mean, you know, people are religious for a whole set of reasons, which are not necessarily straightforwardly, kind of coldly, internally rational, but rather they're rational in a particular type of context.
Sure.
And that's why I think it's so the crisis is not perhaps one of faith. The crisis is, how do you give an account, a rationale for what you do as a believing person? Right? And that's really the question that people ask. The question, people don't ask you, so when you're sitting at home, do you really think about, does God exist or not? They basically say, why do you do this? That's the issue, and that's where the challenges arise. And that's what people are required to do. You know, why do you behave in a particular way? Why is your communal practice of religion in this particular type of way? Why do you manifest religious symbols in a particular? And these are all the contentious issues which we have in Europe. Fundamentally, you know, people don't come and ask you, do you believe in God? And is this a rational position? They say, how do you rationalize doing X and Y? And so I think we need to kind of think about that. And it's possible that then people internalize that, right, and say, well, maybe if this is being questioned and I can't provide a rationale for this in this process of objectification, which I'm at the receiving end of, then clearly that must mean God doesn't exist, right? And that's a possible internalization of it. But it's the external manifestations which I think people should be focusing upon.
That's interesting. Thank you. I think it's certainly the case that within various religious traditions there is an internal standard of rational inquiry, right, and not absolutely objective. And I think it's certainly a myth of modernity that it's possible to have objective truths. But I think what I'd like to get at is, the skeptic response is simply that, that's fine. You can have your own internal standard that you define within your community, but is that a public standard? Is that something that you can use at a public level that would apply regardless of whatever faith tradition that you're coming from? Perhaps that's not possible, but I think what I'd like to get at is, who sets that standard? What tool are we using? And is it something that evolves through time, or is it fixed? Sayyid Sulaiman.
I'd like to back up. I think a few issues were raised that are essential and that are very important for us to maybe pause at a little bit. One was the nature of faith. And in addition to the communal dimension, for many people the idea that they have in their mind of Iman or of faith is a very theoretical and a very intellectual type of a conception. They think of believing in God as being a question of the order of believing in a mathematical theorem, which is why the question will come up that are these proofs of God that are found within, say, theology or philosophy, are they convincing or are they not convincing? And why you will have people then sometimes make very juvenile, they might be best-selling authors, but they'll make very juvenile objections about, well, if God is the creator of all of this complexity, then God must be infinitely complex. Things like that, which regardless of the sophistication or how juvenile the argument is, it's based on the idea that the means of approach to God is going to be entirely through a certain definition of rationality, and it will be a passive process. I believe 1 + 1 is 2, not because I make a decision to do so, but because I see that as accurately representing reality. A teaching that we have in the sayings of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wassalam is that Iman consists of a decision. So it's not that it's not a theoretical question in the first place. You will need rationality, and you will need many other faculties of your existence, including all of the set of your emotional faculties, including your sense of beauty and aesthetics. You will need all of those faculties and your faculty of being able to analyze and think and imagine in order to arrive at a decision. But the nature of Iman is an action. It is an action that shows up on the tongue and that shows up with a covenant and a commitment within the heart. There's a tale told, it might be apocryphal, of Ibn Sina and an Arif. And the Arif was asked what he thought of Ibn Sina with his rational proofs and his arguments. And he expressed it saying, "This blind man comes wherever I find that God has brought me with his cane, and I find that every spiritual experience that I have, or every height of gnosis, of ma'rifah that I have attained, that this blind man uses his rationality, his deduction, to reach that same destination." And the conception is that they are not certainly mutually exclusive, and they're also not redundant forms of achieving a shared goal, but they are mutually complementary. And for us as human beings, appreciating rationality is going to be useful if we can fit it effectively and meaningfully within a constellation of all of the faculties that we have within us that allow us to make a decision. As a believer, I will say all of those faculties that God put within us that lead us to the same destination. They might lead us in different ways, and different individuals may have a different ability to use them, but they are meant to bring us to a point where we make a decision, and that is the beginning point of our faith. There's one other brief topic that I wanted to address that comes back to, I think, our earlier question. I don't know if I should wait till the end or...
Maybe if you can hold it.
Sure.
I think we're going to move on to our last question and then have some time to open it up, but it might be actually relevant. So the last thing we kind of want to move into is we've gotten a sense of what some of the challenges are and some of the problems are. And I'd like to end by talking a bit about where you each see the future should head. So in the Muslim world, we've kind of always been characterized as being on the receiving end of modernity and always having to catch up with the modern world. So my question is, where do you see the role of Muslims and Islam in contributing to this critique of modernity? So it's already happening on the Western side, right? There's quite a bit of critique amongst Western intellectuals, and I think a lot of the results of modernity are being questioned now. It's no longer seen as something that's culturally blind or as objective. So where do you see Muslims in this conversation?
Can I just jump in before you end the subject, please?
Sure.
With regards to the demise of faith, as we say, we have to ask the question: why has it evolved? Why is religion today seen with such negative, when someone says I'm religious, or this person is religious, it has negative connotations today, almost like the word, he's a politician.
Right.
Politics today has a negative connotation, although politics is good. But because it's been abused so much, it has taken a negative connotation. Religion has taken a negative connotation today. Faith, Dan Barker, who I debated, he's written a book, Losing Faith in Faith. Okay? The whole notion of faith. And I think if we just touch on one important aspect, that if you look at the evolution of the power of religion, and here Eric Fromm, Shaykh Mutahar uses him as a means of definition in saying religion is a way of life. And everybody has a religion. When people ask you, are you religious? You say, well, I'm as religious as you are. Just that I practice it differently. As Sayyid Sulaiman mentioned, it's all about taking the step of practice. Even the Quran says, قَالَتِ الْأَعْرَابُ آمَنَّا. Allah says, قُلْ لَمْ تُؤْمِنُوا وَلَكِنْ قُولُوا أَسْلَمْنَا وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ, right? You claim to believe. Allah says, no, submit and then belief will come to you. So that submission is essential. But I think if we look at the evolution, the reason there is an aversion to religion today is because it has a connotation of blind faith. The term blind faith is actually lumped into this word religion. When I'm religious, people, oh, you're just a blind ritualist who doesn't really have any basis of rationality, and you've taken a leap of faith. It's almost like, I use the analogy many times, taking a leap of faith. Even the Quran mentions, that you should fly to Allah. Tawakkal, for example. Tawakkal is leap of faith towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But, rationally speaking, to take a leap, you have to check the substance of the very floor that you're taking a leap from. And if it has a trajectory, and if it's got a bouncy substance, it's going to give you a higher push. But taking a leap of faith on quicksand will just make you sink further. But there are people who have held on under the garb of religion with really very weak rationalities, and they've tried to argue in a very weak manner that their faith is stronger than all rationalities. Classic argument when we talk about the Trinity concept. One Catholic priest said, if you ask me about the Trinity, I don't know. But if you don't ask me, I know. and to the rationalist out there, says, okay, that's where the problem is. You want me to come and take this leap, but you cannot substantiate it. You look back in the time of Sigmund Freud, just a quick point, I just want to make a quick point. You find Karl Popper comes in and establishes a scientific method of falsifiability. All of these were because religion had the power of the world. It was ruling. Kings were ruling in the name of God. But there was so much abuse. There was just so many baseless interpretations that trickled down to the society that caused havoc. That the very notion of religion has a negative connotation, and unfortunately, Islam as a religion is being lumped as that, and unfortunately sometimes we have bad role models who misrepresent it also. I just wanted to make that comment. So if we're talking about demise of faith within the modern society, it's not a natural phenomenon. I think it has occurred because of a systematic abuse by those who claim to hold the reins of religion.
Thank you. Professor Ramazan, can you have some final remarks maybe on where we go from here? And then I'd ask the rest of us to just limit your comments so that we can go ahead and open discussion to the audience.
Yes, I think it might be good to have the audience asking questions, but just on the question that you were asking, what could be the role of Muslims? First, let me be quite clear on this. As Muslims living in our time, we should not pretend that we don't have these questions. They are part of the process. And you can see now, and by the way, not only in the West or Western Muslims, throughout the world now, we have some critical questions that are coming from Muslims, because we are, all of us, influenced by the world culture, and the world culture and this, what we call the postmodernity, which is an ideology telling us that there is no longer ideology, is in fact creating a sense of questioning everything and not getting the answer. So we need to be quite clear on this, that today the first thing which I think is necessary is first also to come back to this vision that we have, what I call this cosmology, the way we are with God, the way we are with the universe, and the way we are with ourselves and with human beings. I think that the Islamic narrative is lost in trying just to catch up with what is said by the dominant culture and say, oh, we don't have a problem. I think that we have to reconcile ourselves with the deep meaning of first our own terminology. One of the signs of the dominant is to define for you your terms and your concepts. And when we are lost in many, You can see that the Muslims, even you just go and ask somebody about what do you know about Sharia, and you will see that 90% of what we say it's coming from what the West was saying about Sharia very often. And even if it's not like this, we respond to the West before defining it for ourselves. So this is I will talk about colonization later, but this is alienation, and this is where we are lost. So I would say this reconciliation with our own concept, because deen is not only a way of life, it's deeper than that. It's a concept of death and life and a way of life. But before being a way of life, it's a concept of death. Death is the starting point of everything. It's tell me about death, I will know how you deal with life. And for us, death is not the end, death is the beginning. It's the beginning of something which is a special relationship with God and with our own understanding of life. So I would say that we need to come to this, and our input in this discussion is then to look at the concept that we have, the 5 principles that I was talking about, modernity, and to try also to be quite clear on some of the issues that are important. Why are we saying today that the Islamic majority societies or Muslims are facing a crisis? Because we have to be clear. Many of the essential questions of our time, Muslims are not responding to them. In scientific terms, in ethical terms, it's because the world is changing, the world is moving. And if we are serious about, for example, society, for example, the economic order, we speak about, this economic order is just a shame because it's killing 150,000 people every 2 days. What is the Islamic answer to that? Just to criticize? We don't have the understanding, and we don't have an alternative system. So I would say we can just reject the West, but we also have to do our work, which is how do we deal with these questions when it comes to justice, with the human dignity. Yes, Islam is against racism, but too many Muslims are racists. Yes, Islam is about social order, but too many Muslims, they want to put Islamic to the economic order, but to get exactly the same profit. I'm sorry, that's not the answer. This is where we have to question the goals of the dominant order today, and this is the way we have to be involved in this. And it's a spiritual answer. It is a spiritual answer. I think that we have to reconcile religion with spirituality from the first discussion about religion. Religion is not a set of formal principles or formal rituals. It's a meaning with rituals. And Muslims, in order to resist to the West, they are formalists, and they don't understand enough that the best answer to this domination is resisting with meaning, not only with prohibitions.
I'd like to go ahead and ask for whoever has questions to please come up to a mic, and we'll go ahead and start taking questions from the audience. The mic is right here in the middle, in the aisle. So please just state your name clearly, and if there's someone in particular you'd like to address your question, just make that clear. No, I think...
We can hear you.
My question goes into at the end of the fourth quarter, the end of history. And you see liberals going back to white, liberal principles, liberal votes, So my question is, one is, Islam is compatible with the book. We had Muslims to be accepted as an order, the world order. Number two, if that's not the case, what do you Muslims, or what is our response to that. This is the same way that, for example, the East, China, South Korea, Singapore, they came up with their own actions and saying, you know, wait, it's not the end of the day, there's
So the question is Islam compatible with liberalism? That's what No, I think you used the word liberalism. I think you should define the term liberalism first. The question was, you asked the question, is Islam compatible with liberalism? So you define that as liberalism. Sorry, I jumped in because I needed to sort of kind of get some clarity on what he's saying.
Sure. You've done my job for me. It's easier for me. Does anyone want to address that? Should we keep it at the side?
Well, we're coming, you know, I have a huge problem with getting caught up in apologetics, you know, whether something is compatible with this or that, you know, I mean, you know, is it compatible to be a Muslim and like, you know, be a Jedi or something? I mean, frankly, I really, it's almost like kind of a nonsense at times. And even when you're saying, is it compatible with being a liberal? Well, what sort of liberal do you want? I mean, there are lots of varieties as a liberal. If we're talking about, you know, negative liberty and the harm principle, then there's elements of that which are already in Islamic law. So it's not a huge problem. I mean, Islamic law perfectly understands the concept of a tort, for example. So, you know, that's not a huge issue. Are we talking about liberalism as an inclusive, pluralistic system? Or are we talking about liberalism as an exclusive, particularist system in which you sign up to this or else? And then that has kind of connotations for imperialism and colonialism and so forth as well. So it kind of depends on what you're doing. I think basically people need to understand and be comfortable with where they are before they start thinking about what is compatible. So they need to understand for themselves, why do we do certain types of things? Why do we hold these beliefs? How do we see the world? How do we see our relationship with God? And once you're clear on those, then perhaps the answers to how you relate to the big isms might arise. Or you might actually suddenly realize they're of completely no relevance whatsoever.
Thank you.
And to be honest, the vast majority of your average person has no understanding of what liberalism means. Even if they call themselves liberal, they have no understanding of what that means, apart from perhaps like, you know, leave me alone. And, you know, that's not really a sophisticated philosophical position anyway. So, you know, you've got to start with yourself. And a lot of it's just about, you know, I think to a certain extent in the world in which we live, we've got to be selfish in one sense, which is basically we've got to think about ourselves and our families first. And that's a whole set of things. You know, how do we engage with our kids? I mean, I have kids and I constantly find myself failing as a parent because it's like, how do you even answer simple questions? My son the other day says to me, you know, why would God create us if we sin? You know, and He knows we're going to sin, so why would He do this? That's like a really simple and problematic question, you know. God knows that we're going to be bad. Why would He create us so that we're bad? Very simple sort of things. You know, why do we live on this planet? My 4-year-old said, why do we live on this planet and not another planet? Which planet does God live on? You know, these are very simple kind of, it sounds trivial, but these are the questions which sometimes arise from ourselves. And then of course, in the micro level, it's about how do we live? What do we think is wholesome? You know, what food do we eat? How do we shop? How do we consume? These are like massive, massive issues which have far greater impacts, I think, than how do we debate the large isms.
But can I just ask you a question? If somebody was to ask you that question, how do you define liberalism? Would you use Islam as a believer in Islam? Would that be your starting point in defining terminologies like liberalism. For example, if I asked you, I said, what is your definition of liberalism? I mean, what is my starting point? Should I use Islam, which I adhere to, as my guiding light to define, or do I take on a very objective position?
No, you should always define positions from within that tradition. So basically,
within the community's tradition.
No, within that tradition. So basically, if someone asks you what is liberalism, you need to refer to people who define themselves as liberals and define liberalism. Just as, if someone says, what is Islam, then you of course refer to how Muslim thinkers make sense of Islam. It goes with any kind of thought. If you're imposing upon the other your own categories, then frankly that's not particularly fair. You might want to characterize that in a particular way. But what I'm saying is, instead of getting into that compatibility, you have to understand for yourself, what does it mean for me to believe in God? What does it mean for me to be a moral agent? What does it mean for me to be human? I personally think Islam is very simple. It's basically simple in this sense, that it's basically, what does it mean to be a human? And that's not a simple answer to give, but it's like, what does it mean to be an insan who has certain sort of properties of reflecting God and then reflecting up towards God? What does that mean? And how do we live with that? And then and the consumer issue and the question of technology that's our big challenge. It's not the big isms, which no one really understands what they mean anyway.
Thank you, Professor Rizvi. If we can just have the questions limited to just one question, try to keep the commentary to a minimum, and we'll have just one speaker have maybe a minute or less to address it, because I see a long line and we'd like to get to as many questions as we can. So please go ahead.
So this is just touching on what Haj Hassanein was saying, which is when we define a religious person, there's a negative connotation that is always attached to it, no matter what kind of religion they are. But the way that I feel is that happens because... Can I use this?
Okay, go ahead. Speak up.
Alright. So it happens because there's not that much rationale. When I ask a question, not even if it's a Sayyid or someone that's on a pulpit, I don't get much of an answer, whether it's scientific, mathematical, or whatever. I get another story. How do you feel we can, combat that kind of mentality, which is, I have a person on a pulpit just telling me story after story, but not really answering my question?
Who would you like to address that?
I'll give you a very simple answer why that happens. Is because we have completely lost the notion of public theology. We don't have public theologians. It's as simple as that.
What do you mean by that?
By that, what we mean is, that most people have a certain type of training. We have privileged a certain discipline within the madrasa, which basically is usul al-fiqh. And frankly, they've always focused on a particular aspect of it, which is all about how do we come up with law. Not thinking about what is the law for, which I think requires certain things. There are elements of that in that tradition which can deal, but fundamentally, what is theology? What does it mean to believe in God? You need people who are skilled, who can do that. And within the British context, sorry, I'm probably going over. We always point to, we wish we had someone like Rowan Williams. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, wonderfully nice chap. A good kind of old hippie, very, very bright, can deal with any question that anyone throws at him. And he deals with it from his own tradition, right? Which is actually, he's very hostile to modernity. He's very hostile to secularity and secularism and so forth. But he's someone who is capable of addressing these larger issues. The problem, I think, is that we've trained people who can only address, and correct me if I'm wrong, specific do's and don'ts. And that's our problem.
I think if I can just briefly, I want to move back a little bit to a point that I think, since we are now at the closing period of the session, touch upon the issue that you raised and many of the other issues. We can approach the question of modernity from the question of what are the defining aspects of modernity. For many of us, though, what might be the most effective means is for us to look at problems that we face within life, issues that we face. Some of the issues, for example, that you mentioned with regard to technology, with regard to consumerism, and also theological, moral questions. Many of you might have seen that Daesh recently published a list of do's and don'ts with regard to how to deal with captives of war. And many people will come to their trusted scholar and say, well, what do we say about that? What is our view on how to deal with captives? Is this really Islamic ethics, and is this really Islamic law or not? And when we want to deal with any sort of question of a legal nature or of another nature, what might be useful for us is to try to look at what kind of strategic depth has Islam given us as scholars, as members of a community, as lay people, however we define ourselves. There are going to be areas that many of our institutions are not going to be fully equipped to be able to deal with effectively, institutionally or individually, and there might be some questions that we ourselves are not going to be able to feel that we are equipped to deal with. If you want to try to find a solution to the Islamic economic system, probably if you were to go to existing scholarly institutions anywhere in the Islamic world and from any religious tradition, you will probably walk away somewhat disappointed with the type of solutions that you are going to get. What is the reason for that? One solution that I think would be useful for every individual, and I will wrap up, is to appreciate that Islam has given us a means of strategic depth in approaching these types of questions. When we have maybe an individual or an institution that is not able to provide us sufficient answers, apologetics can be useful, right? But it shouldn't lead to defensiveness. And in some cases, what we can do is we can take certain principles that we have certainty about, that we are satisfied with, and then try to navigate the uncertainty that develops based on the certainty that we get from those principles. If we have a problem, clearly all of us will realize that slavery and some of the rules of slavery that are being applied by certain extremist groups have nothing to do with Islam. And we would dissociate from any school of thought in Islam or any religion that permitted those actions, even if they are found in some form or another in our own classical texts. Using that methodology of trying to navigate uncertainty by finding and affirming certain principles that give us certainty will assist us in being able to answer questions like that. And to deal with areas where we do have gaps, we do have weaknesses within our institutions. I don't know if we have time to go through any examples, but I'll stop there. If we do have time, then we can maybe get some examples of that.
Thank you, Sayyid Sulaiman. I think I was given the green light to extend this to just one more question. So please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm the lucky one, right? Thank you.
Yep.
So with regards to contemporary philosophy, I've come across a couple of well-known philosophers such as Edward Kessler, who has come across saying that the current range of philosophers in existence today, the ones that write the best-selling novels like Krauss, they're not philosophers, but they're big names, Krauss, Dan Barker, Richard Dawkins, and that even overlap within the astrophysicist world like Hawking, as well as Neil deGrasse Tyson, have absolutely no grasp on philosophy. And the questions that are being brought today with regards to the existence of God have already been answered. But those texts, that knowledge is lost amongst them with this new idea of this scientific rationale. I was wondering if you have any commentary on that. Thank you.
I think it's a good question, brother. Thank you for asking. You know, it's interesting when I would debate atheists and you bring the ontological, cosmological, teleological arguments, they just like, we don't believe in that. I said, well, why don't you? Well, because it's been disproven. I said, by what? You know, I mean, it's almost like saying, you're showing me evidence, but the burhan is here, but I don't want it. It's almost like to belittle it. So I think there's this concerted effort to try to marginalize some very obvious answers that leads one to have certainty, towards, for example, the belief in God. And it's to me, it's very fascinating that you will have a collection of people like Barker and Dawkins. If you read Dawkins' arguments, really at the bottom line, even when he was interviewed with Mehdi Hassan at Oxford, you could read between the lines that he's really just angry with the established systems. And all he wants to do is he wants to rattle it and wants to cleanse it. That's why sometimes I say atheists are like sanitizers of religion. They come and remove the barnacles. They come and ask questions the average won't ask. And then you sort of get into this collision, in having to reconcile belief systems. And it's not unhealthy. So just to give you a quick gist of the answer, that I think all these counter arguments, including Dawkins, there's a reason why Dawkins is a Dawkins in the sense of where his perspectives are. It's because holistically there have been all kinds of misrepresentations within a sphere of religion, for example, that trickles down to the average person who gets very annoyed. Barker, for example, says, 28 years, I think it was 28 years, I was an evangelist, and I was fooled, and therefore I became angry with God. And now I've gone on a pathway to challenge him, and to challenge his existence. It's almost like reactionary, And so when we look at all these philosophers who come and write all kinds of possible arguments, including including Hawking's, the basic argument is, and I don't want to go too into Dr. Ramadan, inshallah, if you can make a point on that, but we have this notion today that if a scientist who's very established, like Dawkins is a scientist, so therefore we somehow innately give him credence. Because he's a scientist, he must have used very rational logic to approach the conclusion that there's no God. Or when Hawking speaks that, God doesn't exist, Hawking's, astrophysicist, world-renowned. If he says there is no God, then there's a very high likelihood that God doesn't exist. And we should be very clear in saying the empirical observations, the 5 senses of empirical observations, is just pure empirical science. Science cannot adjudicate moral arguments. It doesn't have the capacity. Okay, it's the philosophers and the famous statements, as the scientists climbed up to the mountains to figure out the existence of God, they found the philosophers were already there. So it's a philosophical argument. As the brother mentioned, that scientists who make philosophical arguments have actually stepped the boundaries. They're no longer scientists. And you cannot use science as a means by which you now say, that's it, I have therefore concluded there is no God. You have stepped the boundaries of your jurisdiction. And I think if we understand that, when a scientist says that there's no God, they said, how are you saying that? On what ground? Did you put probes in space? Lack of evidence is never evidence for an argument. So what did you mean by this? So I think that's just my perspective, that when I go out there and I see that moral arguments, ethical arguments, are higher than the empirical methods of science.
Professor Rizvi, if you can limit it to maybe 30 seconds, and then...
in British society, basically our public intellectuals are scientists and novelists. It's as simple as that, right? So no one takes philosophers seriously. The odd theologian kind of creeps in, someone like Rowan, but that's pretty much it. It's basically scientists and novelists are considered to be public intellectuals. That's not the case in other societies, and I don't know what it's like here. So there's a peculiarity there. I would just mention one work, if you're really interested, and I think the reason why it's important is not only does it kind of critique sort of neo-atheist views, but it also critiques a lot of religious views. And that's David Bentley Hart's The Experience of God. Because his precise point is, we don't even understand what the question is about the existence of God, let alone what the arguments are. And he does a wonderful case of basically doing that. So I would suggest you have a look at that. It's a wonderfully engaging work.
Professor Ramadan, any final remarks for us? No pressure. Or Sayyid Sulaiman, if there's anything else you'd like to end on.
Many subjects that I think there's many areas that I think we've broached, and one area that I think we might not be able to get in this session, which is fine, the remainder of the sessions of this conference and what you will take away, will inshallah be how do we look for answers to some of those kinds of challenges that we have, whether they are very mundane challenges, how do you answer your 4-year-old son, or whether they are more global challenges. It would be nice to have a question: how many of us would want to live under Sharia? And if many of us would say, well, I'm not really sure if I would want to live under Sharia, does that mean that we are secular? Now, we can approach that from a perspective, just to take one example, we can approach that from a perspective of trying to define secularism, different possibilities and different definitions, or different practical, political, social models that exist. Or we can try and approach it, and this is very accessible to even a layperson, from the perspective of when somebody says we're going to have Sharia guide our life, what is it that raises a red flag for me? And then how am I going to go about resolving that? Do I have a conception of Sharia that is compatible with some definition of secularism? Or do I reform my understanding or refine my understanding of what Sharia is? And finding for ourselves, from our faith, from our religion, what are those anchors of certainty that can assist us to navigate those numerous areas of discordance or uncertainty, will be of immense help in being able to respond to that kind of a challenge. I think that the insights that we've had should be one small step in that direction, and I hope that we will have an opportunity to discuss more such issues in the next few days.
Thank you very much, Sayyid Sulaiman. Professor Ramadan, would you like to end with anything for us? Okay, well, I invite you all to join us later in the evening when I think we'll be able to hear more from Professor Ramadan. So please do attend that talk. Just a few announcements before we break out. Please maintain the cleanliness of the hotel and your conduct as well. Parents, don't forget your children in childcare. Salah is at 4:45, so please join us there. Please attend the night program, which is 9 to 10 p.m. in the junior ballroom. It'll feature poetry, skits, TED Talks, not the real one, but we get pretty close, Latmia, etc. Please also attend the nightly discussion sessions from 10 to 11 p.m. in the Magnolia Room, brought to you in collaboration with Chicago, where the discussions will explore race relations and gender relations in our communities. We'll be selling raffle tickets at the reception desk. Prizes are iPad Mini, Nook, and Apple TV, and tickets are $3 each. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming. Please join me in thanking our scholars.